Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar discussing the African Continental Free Trade Area / Agreement and post-COVID-19 considerations. This webinar is jointly hosted by the Cyrus Vance Center for International Justice, which is part of the New York City Bar Association, and Oraro and Company Advocates, an affiliate member of AB and David Africa, based in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Emeka Chenwuba, and I'm your moderator. I'm a project finance partner at McDermott, Will & Amory, based in New York, and my practice focus is primarily on energy and infrastructure projects. I'm also a co-chair of the Africa Committee of the Vance Center in New York. I will introduce the panelists. We are delighted to have them here, and why don't we start with Cindy Oraro.
Thank you all for joining this webinar today. As you've heard, my name is Cindy Oraro. I'm a partner here at Oraro and Company Advocates in Nairobi. I specialize in energy infrastructure projects. A bit about Oraro and Company: we're a full-service law firm based here in Nairobi, founded in 1977. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Cindy. Agnes?
Hi everyone, my name is Agnes Gitao. I work for GPS Africa. We're an advisory services firm where we provide political and economic risks intelligence, but we are also keeping track of the AfCFTA. I also sit on the board of the East Africa Association. And for those of you from East Africa, I'm part of the team that puts together the annual East Africa International Arbitration Conference. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Agnes. Michael, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Apalhila from AB and David, the Ghana office. AB and David Africa is a Pan-African law firm. We are able to assist clients in about 30 out of the 55 countries in Africa. My areas of specialization are government, business, regulation, dispute resolution, and Africa trade. I currently serve on the board of Ghana's Services Export Subcommittee of the Ministry of Trade and Industries, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Meluleki, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Meluleki Nzimande. I'm a partner at Weber Wenzel. Weber Wenzel is a full-service law firm. Also Pan-African law firm. We have an association with Linklaters, and we have friend law firms across the length and breadth of the continent. My area of specialty is international trade, and I sit within the unit called Competition, Trade and Investment Unit, which has got a focus on Africa. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Meluleki. We'll jump right into it to discuss this important topic, which I'm sure all of us have been keeping track of, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. But just before we jump into the questions, for the participants, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So feel free as the discussion goes along. We want this to be as interactive as possible to ask questions, and we'll try to get them either during the session or at the end of the session, subject to time permitting. So going right into it, the African Continental Free Trade Area is an ambitious trade pact to form the world's largest free trade area, actually the largest since the WTO. And the goal is to create a single continental market for goods and services. And we're talking about a coverage of over 1.3 billion people across 55 African countries. The agreement has been signed by 54 of the 55 member states of the AU, Eritrea being the outlier, and about 45 signatories have now ratified that agreement, which is great in terms of its implementation. Michael, why don't we start with you? So obviously the agreement was initially signed pre-COVID, then COVID happened in 2020, and we all know that impacted multiple areas of our lives, from economic issues to even just political issues as well. What's the current status of the free trade agreement in terms of its implementation, building up to COVID, during COVID, and where we sit today in this post-COVID era?
Well, thank you very much, Emeka. So like you rightly said, the AfCFTA is the largest free trade area in terms of participating countries. I just want to highlight that the largest per se is the RCEP because they have larger GDP. The AfCFTA is part of the grander agenda of the AU, which is the Agenda 2063, and it's just one of the sub themes of this large agenda. The aim of the AfCFTA is to increase intra-Africa trade and boost the facilitation and liberalization of various trade policies of the member states. Like you rightly said, 55 out of the countries of Africa have signed on, and currently we have 45 who have ratified, and by ratified, who have deposited their instruments of ratification. By that, I mean they have fulfilled all the legal requirements that properly brings them under the ambit of the agreement. The agreement was planned to be implemented in phases. So there was phase one, which was for the protocol on trade in goods, trade in services, and for dispute resolution mechanisms. Then there's a phase two, which looks at competition policy, investment, and intellectual property. Then the final phase, which is the protocol on e-commerce. There has been talk recently of another protocol for youth and women, but we are not too sure at the moment under which of the phases this particular one is going to go into. So before COVID hit, phase one was being implemented. There were discussions for the protocol on trading goods and trading services. In fact, before COVID hit, the secretariat, which is in Accra, was being set up. Recruitment was ongoing, and there were many negotiations for trading goods and trading services so that the proper documents be adopted as annexes to the main protocols. You would see that even before the AfCFTA, intra-Africa trade has been hovering around, let's say, 10% from the early 2000s, about 14% in 2014. At about 2018, when the discussion of the AfCFTA started, we are about 19%. Then COVID hit. When COVID hit, productivity slowed, production reduced, borders were closed, and the implementation date for trading to start under the protocol for trading goods was postponed from July 2022. And industry analysts were expecting that intra-Africa trade will increase further, but that was cut down because of COVID to about 14%. Now, fast forward after COVID, we see that productivity is now increasing. Intra-Africa trade is increasing little by little, and governments have tried to mitigate the postponement of official trading by starting symbolic trade arrangements. For those who have been monitoring, just recently on the 26th of September, there was trade between 7 countries under the AfCFTA. So basically, you could see that COVID-19 had an impact. It reduced the amount of trade that we were originally experiencing. But after COVID, it has picked up, and the member states are trying to pick up interest from the private sector so that trade can continue. So I mean, I would say these for now and for other questions. Thank you.
You're on mute, Emeka.
My apologies. I was saying that's very interesting in terms of how the pandemic impacted impacted the implementation of the treaty and what we're seeing now in a supposedly post-COVID era. During the build-up to the implementation of the signing of the treaty, a number of countries had, significant concerns, particularly the larger countries, in terms of how the protocols under the treaty would impact local labor markets, for instance, in manufacturing sectors locally in countries. But it seems that, initially the hesitation, they overcame them, and we have all these countries having signed up today. Nigeria was one of those countries as an example. How from your perspective, how did these countries get comfortable with the free trade agreement, and did the treaty actually try and resolve some of these issues?
Okay, so like everyone says, the AfCFTA is a game changer. It disrupts everything that we are used to. So it was to be expected that the larger economies would be a bit skeptical about its whole implementation. But one good thing about the protocol, about the AfCFTA, is that it is an agreement, a base agreement based on which there are many protocols. And on the protocols, we have annexes. Now, these annexes are subject to agreements by parties. So in fact, if you take the protocol on trade in goods, for example, there are annexes that talk about the rules of origin. Now, the rules of origin have undergone a lot of discussion. So many of the problems that the big nations or the big economies were having are being dealt with under the annexes. So, for example, if you look at the current state that we have, the rules of origin, about 88% of all the rules have been agreed, like you rightly mentioned in your intro. But then there are some key ones that have not been agreed, like the automobile industry, but also food and then a few textiles have not been agreed. These ones are being resolved. So the general idea is that we can still proceed with about 90% that have been agreed while we resolve the issues. So I think this has been the balancing act that the AfCFTA Secretariat and the negotiators have had to go around the challenge.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I think the ministers of trade had agreed to allow trading of some of like 850 products to commence under the rule of origin protocol. So things like cheese, edible oils, fish, machinery, etc. While other products like tobacco products, automobiles, clothing, textiles were kind of reserved for further deliberation. Cindy, I'd like to bring you in here. Again, the negotiation around the rules of origin, as Michael mentioned, I think that's a good segue, have proved to be a real, initially were a sticking point. Notwithstanding, there's been agreement on about 80 to 85% of goods, but you still have the 15%, which still accounts for a significant portion of the economics. When you look at it. Some countries have been arguing for more stringent rules of origin to ensure that preference accrues only to members and is not deflected to non-members, while other countries with weaker productive capabilities have been advocating for more flexibility. What are you seeing, and what kind of resolutions have you seen in this regard, or is the jury still out on this?
Well, Emeka, I think we'll need to take a step back and look at the fact that of the 43 least developed countries in the world, 33 of them are African states. And that basically means that we have countries at, varied levels of development. Some of them are not industrialized to the level where they can take the maximum advantage of the AfCFTA. So that has guided to a great extent the negotiations on the rules of origin. Obviously, countries that don't have the manufacturing capacity would not want to have very stringent rules of origin that would allow them demand that these countries have established value chains, the manufacturing capability to be able to contribute, to have as much local input as possible. it's something that needs variation, and within this panel, luckily there's a lot of expertise to delve deeper into that problem. But just to highlight that, firstly, the AfCFTA has been considerate in classifying least developed countries and giving them the latitude, first of all, to implement tariffs in a longer duration, which is 10 years, rather than the non-least developed countries, which have 5 years to implement. And then also the AfCFTA has classified certain sensitive classes of goods, which would have at least a 13-year period in which to standardize tariffs. And I think that's one way of addressing the issue. But ultimately, when these rules on origin are finalized, and as you have rightly pointed out, they've been a sticking point, they'll need to take into consideration the varying levels of development of each of the member states, and to see how they can, number one, first of all, support the development of African value chains, but also not stifle the economies of the least developed countries on the continent.
Interesting. No, it just shows. It also just reflects the level of how complicated it can be. Getting so many countries that are very different in many ways in terms of development, local industries, bring them under one single umbrella, and move in a coordinated approach going forward. So that's I guess that's something we'll need to continue watching. The African Continental Free Trade Area, it could potentially have a combined GDP of about 3.4 trillion, but achieving its full potential depends on significant policy reforms, trade facilitation measures across the signatory nations. Cindy, again, just staying with you here. So besides the impacts of COVID, which we've just discussed, and the rules of origin, sticking issues, what have been some of the other key challenges in the implementation and execution under the agreement?
All right, so I think critical would be infrastructure. And I think you need to take into consideration that because of the colonial history in almost all the countries on the continent, our infrastructure was geared towards extracting goods from Africa, usually primary commodities, and shipping them outside the continent. So we have not developed the sort of infrastructure that can boost intra-African trade. And whilst we have the legal structure of the AfCFTA, obviously there needs to be a lot more investment in infrastructure to boost trade between African countries, which accounts for only about 13% of the trade we have on the continent. So that's the first thing. The second is has already been touched on. The structure of the AfCFTA is we have the agreement itself as the umbrella document, and then various protocols that fall under it. As Michael highlighted, none of them have been fully negotiated. We have the protocol on trade of goods, which is 80% complete in terms of negotiation. But unless these protocols are finalized and agreed upon, then there will not be impetus in terms of trade, because the instruments necessary for such trade will not have been put in place. The third one is the fact that the AfCFTA came into force in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So not only is there already reduced intra-African trade, or minimal, the COVID-19 pandemic meant that there was shutdowns, African economies were struggling. There wasn't that much impetus for intra-African trade at that point. So it's only now, the year 2022, that we're seeing efforts towards having trade transactions pursuant to the treaty. Just to summarize, unless we have the legal instruments, all the legal instruments necessary for trade put in place, we're not going to get far. However, it's also important to take into consideration that the implementation of a trade agreement like the AfCFTA is a long-term process. The EU customs union, as we know it today, took 72 years to put into place. So it's going to take us a while, but once we target, African resources and also encourage foreign direct investment towards, intra-African trade and investment in infrastructure to boost that trade, we should see a lot of progress.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Agnes, as we've discussed, the agreement aims to reduce tariffs amongst, members and covers policy areas such as trade facilitation, services, regulatory measures, technical barriers to trade, etc. So since coming to, and we've talked about some of the challenges with implementation, right? But since coming into effect, there have been some milestones. What are some of the milestones we've seen, or what are the wins we can highlight, so at this point?
Thank you very much, Emeka. And perhaps before I even add before I comment on some of the wins, my comment will be, yes, there are a lot of challenges. And as Cindy alluded to, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And the first step of that under AfCFTA is just the recently, and Michael touched on it briefly, the recently launched guided trade initiative under AfCFTA. Already 8 countries were a little bit ready participating in this, and those countries include Cameroon, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Mauritius, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Tunisia. And the reason for this guided trade initiative is to try and test the preparedness of the treaty, the legal structures, the institutions, the readiness of the private sector, so that, and also to try and influence other countries to participate in the trade agreement. Already, maybe not quite a huge amount, but at least over $2 million value of trade has been traded under this guided trade initiative. And what the AfCFTA Secretariat is doing is to handhold, if you like, some of the countries which are ready, because as you said, Emeka, we are all very different in terms of our economic capacity, or how our economies are, and we cannot all be ready at the same time. So really pushing forward the countries that are ready and helping them to already start operating under the treaty. The other one which you alluded to is that at least 45 countries have already ratified the treaty, right? And I think this is quite a milestone to get the political buy-in, to get governments to see that there is actually value if we are able to promote regional trade, and in the politicians agreeing to it, I think then it will facilitate the private sector to participate in the trade. Also, I think another milestone which the Secretariat has done a lot is really going from country to country, speaking to private sector, particularly the SMEs. We know over 60% of African traders are in the SME sector, trying and build capacity, helping them with trade competitiveness training. And I think that really is quite something we can report to. Again, there are so many challenges, access to trade finance, the non-tariff barriers we talk about, logistics costs, which Cindy alluded to. But as I said, it's a long journey, and I think what we're seeing, it's a move from high-profile political declaration to actually getting to the ground and getting the private sector to try and see, will this actually work? And I guess for me, the initiative, the guided trade initiative, one, we can report back because we can already sort of quantify the value of trade. I know it's quite little, $2 million, but I guess in the next 1 year or so, we'll see more and more countries and more companies participating. And perhaps to add that some of the products that are under this initiative are horticulture, pharmaceuticals, batteries, and I think tea. And one of the countries that has participated in this is my country, Kenya. I think it is a sign that we understand the value of the agreement and what it means for Kenya's private sector. I do hope that other countries can follow suit.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe just a question for just anyone who wants to take it is, so historically, on the continent we've had regional economic communities, right? ECOWAS, SADC, etc. And those regions actually had already established some level of of free trade protocols as well. Now, obviously, in the build up to the Africa Free Trade area, those different regions were meant to be additive, right? So it was meant to be a benefit that we already have regional blocks, and we could just tie in, build on top of that. Has that been successful, or because there's been some writings that, to some degree, that was also a hindrance in terms of different regions having different protocols that already existed, and harmonizing them, was a bit problematic. Well, what have you seen in that regard?
Okay, Emeka, if I may, to add to what was just said about the milestone, I think Agnes pointed out. I think one major thing that signals the progress is the launch of the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, the PAPS. I believe this is one of the things the AfCFTA Secretariat should be very proud of, because it solves a lot of the challenges and the problems that are associated with trading across the continent. Like Cindy alluded to, most of how our trade currently is based on our colonial, it's a vestige of our colonial heritage, and it's tied to the West. With the PAPS in force now, people do not have to use the hard currencies that we are all used to in the past, that kind of affect most African economies quite terribly. So that's one thing I want to highlight. And now to your question about the regional economic groupings and blocks. The agreement establishing the AfCFTA recognizes these blocks and actually encourages that they call them the acquis be maintained. And I would say that these regional economic groupings have helped in the implementation of the AfCFTA. One of the things we don't say often is that the AfCFTA is being achieved in record speed. Cindy was saying that the EU used about 72 years to get to where they are now. But the AfCFTA discussions began, of course, the blueprint started with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. I must say so, since I'm from Ghana myself. But we started discussing it really in 2018. And 4 or 5 years down the line, see where we got to. So this is because of the regional economic grouping. ECOWAS like this, for example, negotiates as a block. I know many other blocks also negotiate together, so it helps quicken the process. Thank you.
Maybe just to add, and I agree with what Michael has said. When you look at another example, we've got the WTO, which is a global trade regulation body, and it coexists with other regional bodies, whether you're looking here in Africa, or you're looking in the US, you're looking in Asia, or even Western Europe. So we are not unique as such in Africa in having regional bodies that coexist with a continental body, as it were. And regarding the issue of implementation and risk mitigation, I thought maybe I should just comment there. One of the learnings that we have taken as the African continent from other experiences in implementing the AfCFTA is for instance, the mitigation of the adverse impact that the agreement or the implementation of the agreement may have on state parties. We all know that one of the key implementation requirements is the establishment of free movement of goods, i.e. the reduction of import duties by parties to the agreement. For those countries that are dependent largely on taxes that they derive from import duties, the reduction of duties is obviously going to spell a substantial reduction in their revenues. And in recognition of that risk, and recognition of the risk to industries, the AfCFTA or the heads of state have requested the Secretariat and AfCFTA to look at establishing an adjustment fund. And the adjustment fund has got three components: the general component, the credit component, and the base fund. The base fund is the one that is going to, amongst other things, assist countries and offset the loss of revenue that is expected to follow the implementation of the AfCFTA. And that fund is going to be supported by contribution by member states of the AfCFTA, grant funding and technical assistance from other governments or friendly parties outside the continent or even on the continent. The general fund is meant to raise concessional funding to support projects that are earmarked, whether it's for infrastructure or other development in the continent. And the commercial fund is also earmarked to raise commercial funding for development, industrial development. So that shows that part of the reason why, as Michael correctly points out, there seems to be, at least at this stage, significantly faster movement. I think it's because the negotiators and the leaders of Africa have sought as much as possible to learn from the experiences of other regions of the world. Thank you.
No, and Meluleke, that was a good segue to the question regarding, just risk generally, risks that come with, opening up your economies and, forming continental blocks as this agreement seeks to do. And the question obviously, I was going to flip to you was, what are some of those risks? And, one of them is obviously the loss of revenue from the elimination or reduction of tariffs. But with respect to the fund itself, so how is that fund generated, so to speak? And is the idea that that AfCFTA or one of the other DFIs would manage the fund, or is the Secretariat seeking to have some kind of fund management function as well? Has there been any information on that?
There's still some thinking around that, but the expectation is that AfCFTA will manage the fund, well, subject obviously to working with the Secretariat. The work around the establishment of the fund is still ongoing, but I think the key message really is that there is a facility that's going to be put in place to mitigate the downside of the implementation of the agreement, particularly amongst the smaller economies on the region. But perhaps to link to what you're saying about other risks that are associated with the implementation of the agreement, I mean, one of the key things, and I think the rules of origin point that Cindy made is key to this. One of the risks that you face as members of the AfCFTA is that a party may bring goods from, say, China, transship them through, say, South Africa, and sell them on, say, to Zimbabwe as if it's a good that's manufactured in South Africa when actually it's manufactured in China. And to mitigate that risk, it is important that the rules of origin are in place so that when you as a South African company or a player export goods to Zimbabwe, you accompany those goods with a certificate of origin, which then attests to the fact that a significant value that makes up the good was generated in South Africa. That value differs from product to product, but 25%, 30%, 40%, 50%, but it must be something really substantial, ideally 100%. The other risk, of course, is unfair trade. That's a universal risk. You can have goods being traded at what we call in trade language dumped prices, with the effect that they undercut the competing domestic industry of the importing country to such a degree as to cause it to not only to be injured, but to be at risk of disappearing. That under WTO language and also in the AfCFTA is recognized as and unfair trade practice that must be combated. And within it, the AfCFTA has built in a provision for trade remedies, as they're referred to enable state parties to take action where and impose duties to offset or mitigate the risk of injurious dumping, as it is called. So yeah, maybe I should stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, and it's just interesting because it seems that there are examples across the world that that we can learn from, such that we can literally pretty much learn from other people's mistakes as opposed to our mistakes, which is really interesting and fascinating. Just to pivot a bit. So there's been a lot of emphasis on goods, right? The free movement of goods, but we also know that the service sector on the continent makes for a significant portion of the economic upside, particularly as this agreement is implemented. Michael, how have you seen the service sector being addressed under the agreement? What are the discussions surrounding services and the free movement of people vis-a-vis services?
Thank you very much, Emeka. I think when we come to trade, there's a traditional bias for trading goods. And well, you can't blame people for having that bias. It's just because goods are things we can see, we can feel, we can handle. So there's a tendency to ignore services. However, services play a very important role in Africa. An article I read recently has the services sector in Africa employing about 80% of persons who are employed. And that is the story for most African economies. Services employ a lot of people. In fact, more people than those that are employed by manufacturing, which normally brings out goods. So even though there's a natural bias for trading goods, the caution I would sound is that we pay attention also to the trading services. I will not fault the AfCFTA Secretariat much because the trading services has been put in phase 1. So there's as much emphasis on services as there is on trade. However, there seems to be a little hesitancy by member states with regards to movement of persons. And like you rightly pointed out, trade in services is inextricably linked to movement of persons, because especially in the informal trading services, the people have to move from one place to another before they can render such services. The protocol on free movement of persons has about, I think, 32 member states signing, and only 4 or 5 member states, as at my last check, have actually ratified it. And that has to be resolved, because if Africa is to make the maximum benefit from the AfCFTA trade in services, we must make sure it goes hand in hand with the free movement of persons. I think law firms have a very key role to play in this, because we advise professional bodies, we advise people who provide service, we even advise governments. It's something we do here. The advocacy must be launched and promoted to ensure that as we promote trading goods, we also promote trading services, even if it means we have to relax some of our policies a little bit.
You're spot on there, and thank you for that. So why don't we take one of the questions that came through the chat, and this is directed to Agnes. It said that 39 million more people are falling into poverty after the pandemic, with the rising cost of energy, food prices in the region. How does the AfCFTA achieve free trade and secure trade more than ever?
Thank you very much, Emeka. Thank you, Richard, for that question. I think one of the objectives of AfCFTA is to promote industrialization, which hopefully will create more jobs for the continent. One of the biggest challenges for the continent, we talk about high rates of unemployment, right? So if more people have access to quality job, then I hope that addresses issues of high cost of living. In my view, I think obviously governments have an incredible role to play to address in-country challenges of inflation and high cost of energy. Investment in infrastructure is one thing, in making sure that policies for doing business, conducive environment for doing business. Cindy alluded to cost of energy. If you're going to promote manufacturing, cost of energy is key. So having policies that attract investment in the energy sector, I guess that will ultimately address issues of energy cost for production. But in general, the rising cost of energy and inflation, I mean, that's a global, that's an issue that every economy, even developed economies, are experiencing. I think it's collective policies. How do we come up with collective policies to address the current economic crisis that we are all of us are going through? One of those is, how do we create local industries? And I think AfCFTA has a role to play in that. How do we create how do we support SMEs, right? How do we create resilience in regional economies rather than depending on the international market, particularly for imports? So I think that's a way that the agreement hopefully ultimately will be able to address. I do hope that that's, and given the objective on industrialization, promoting manufacturing sector, I do, but ultimately, I guess it depends on government policies in country and maybe other countries borrowing more successful models to try and address that.
Thank you, Agnes, for that. And I think similarly, I think that's on a related topic also in terms of investments. The treaty is meant to promote investments at the end of the day. To build up local manufacturing capabilities, to build up various kinds of infrastructure, human infrastructure, social infrastructure. Meluleki, because investments obviously key driver of economic development, which is what this treaty is trying to spur with the protocols. How does this support or drive or increase investments on the continent, particularly in the post-COVID era?
Thanks once again, Emeka. The establishment of the AfCFTA, as Mike correctly said, was first conceptualized by Kwame Nkrumah back in the day, and that was in recognition of the difficulties, particularly the economic hardship that people of the continent faced, and the fact that the continent is well endowed with minerals and well endowed with human capital. And the challenge has been to convert those things into common prosperity for the citizens of the continent. Let me start first by jumping back to what was said right at the beginning, that South Africa has got more than 1.3 billion people. What's interesting in that is that in that mix, you've got 70% of that in sub-Saharan Africa being of the age of 30 or less. So you've got a very youthful population. That population is able to work. That population, if it works, is able to buy and consume and consume goods. That population is able to innovate and produce. So that becomes one of the attractions about Africa from an investment point of view. There is young, vibrant labor that you can tap into to build your business and grow your business. We often speak of COVID as something that was a major setback, which it was both from a health point of view and both from an economic point of view. I think Michael spoke to that. But there are also other positives that COVID created. One of them is that the disruption, for instance, of international supply chains has meant that countries have to be less dependent on foreign supply of goods and start building their own factories in order to start supplying themselves. You know, one of the things that was a big challenge for us as Africans was the access to COVID vaccines. I read somewhere that more than 9 billion vaccine doses were produced, but less than 600 million ended in Africa. And what does that mean? That means there's an opportunity for vaccine plants, vaccine operations to be set up in Africa. And it's starting to happen. I know that in South Africa, Aspen has, at the height of COVID, allocated 500 million rand to increase its vaccine production in South Africa. But I am also aware that I think it's countries like Ghana have also started to look at increasing vaccine production. So those are some of the opportunities that COVID has presented and has basically brought to the fore the importance of self-reliance. One of the things that we have to contend with now as a consequence of COVID are increased shipping costs, which means that goods that are being imported from faraway lands onto our continent are now costing a lot more than they did before COVID, purely because of shipping costs, also because of shortage of shipping lines. So you've got that environment that COVID has created. I just want to perhaps refer to a few figures that just show investment trends over the last 2 or so years. According to UNCTAD, the COVID pandemic had a significant impact on foreign direct investment in Africa, as flows to the continent declined by 16% to about 40 billion from 47 billion in 2019. So 40 billion in 2020, 47 billion in 2019, that's a substantial drop. Greenfield projects announcements as a measure of investor sentiment and future FDI trends dropped by 62% to 29 billion from a high of 77 billion, and these are US dollars in 2019. Cross-border mergers and acquisitions fell by 45% to 3.2 billion US dollars from 5.8 billion in 2019. So COVID was a major setback, but we are also seeing a rebound. As of June 2022, FDI to African countries hit about 83 billion in 2021 US dollars. And Greenfield's announcements amounted to about 39 billion. Again, that's data from UNCTAD as of June 2022. So we are seeing a rebound. It's not as quickly as we might want it to be, but it's definitely there. And there is a case, I think, to be made for countries, I mean, for investors to be interested in Africa.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and those are interesting figures there, and to some degree, it's also a reflection of what we're seeing even in other parts of the world as well, where deep supply chain issues, but at the same time, to some degree, as a result of government policy, new opportunities have arisen. Right now, there's, particularly on the infrastructure side, and even in North America now, there's just a huge pipeline that is a result of specific policies that were born out of the COVID era. So we have a few more questions that came in through the Q&A function, but why don't we just staying on investment, Cindy? What are you seeing in terms of how the agreement would spur increase in the much needed infrastructure? We talked about countries having varying degrees of infrastructure development that would affect how the treaty impacts them adversely or positively in the short run. How would this agreement over the long term, spur investment on the infrastructure side, on the power side? Obviously, power has always been a big issue on the continent, social infrastructure, human infrastructure.
Well, I'll start with the power side, just because there's already so much impetus going on in that industry. So as we all know, we have 5 regional power pools in Africa. And even before the AfCFTA, even before its launch, they were seeking to collaborate. And that was very difficult because there were no harmonized policy, there was no harmonized policy or regulation. And the market was fragmented in that investors, the much needed foreign direct investment was happening on a country to country basis. Now with the AfCFTA, there's at least a framework under which these power pools can now harmonize regulation and the much needed harmonization of tariffs as well. Once that happens, then we are looking at a continental market rather than country-based markets. And that would mean investors obviously have a much larger investment market to target, but also we would hope that it would attract much larger projects. There's a great need for power generation in order for us to realize the industrialization goals of the African Union and for us to realize the objectives of the AfCFTA. So once this is done, once this harmonization of law and policy and regulation is done, then it will, we hope, catalyze investment, particularly in the private equity space, which in a country like Kenya attracts a lot of private equity participation in the energy sector. Obviously, once the harmonization will reduce the need for due diligence, for example, for projects, as well as the risk associated with investing on a country-to-country basis. And with regard to the power pools, then it will also allow for much easier bilateral power purchase agreements between these different power pools. Luckily, as Michael mentioned, PAPS is creating systems by which individual countries can pay in their local currencies. And this has been one of the sticking points as to how these different power pools operate. Obviously, power is paid for in local countries, in the local currency, but almost all these power projects are funded in US dollars. Having a payment system that facilitates trade in local currency, even with an adjustment mechanism within it, will make intra-African power trade easier. When we come to other types of infrastructure, it becomes a lot more complex, simply because at present we do not have Africa-wide initiatives to develop infrastructure. As you all know, Africa has turned east to fund very large infrastructure projects. It's not clear at present whether there will be a collaborative effort under the AfCFTA to fund infrastructure. However, the AfCFTA is quite flexible as an agreement. And we hope that once the basic protocols are negotiated, the focus can turn to how we can develop much needed infrastructure, particularly to boost intra-Africa trade.
Yeah. And Meluleki, so how would the adjustment fund and have an impact in this regard, particularly the general fund that's meant to take care of concessional funding?
Yes, absolutely. Apart from mitigating the risk that the agreement brings, the fund also, in its structure, aims to boost or to make fund available for projects that enable the implementation of the AfCFTA. And as Cindy correctly points out, or as correctly pointed out also, Emeka, infrastructure is key to the implementation of the agreement. So if you've got concessional funding under the general fund that funds projects that are aimed at facilitating logistics integration, for example, the fund would look at making funds available for that, or at least crowding in private sector to roll out some of those some of those projects. Just by way of it's not even an example, really. It's just something interesting that I saw recently. It was a map of Africa which showed trade routes, trade routes that lead from Cape Town to Cairo. One traveling on the eastern side of the continent and one traveling on the western side of the continent. What I found fascinating was that those corridors are already in place with maybe what I would call potholes or interruptions here and there, but there's already something to build on there. So I found that quite interesting, and it was quite a beautiful image which I kept for myself.
No, yeah, no, that's pretty interesting, and I really think the adjustment fund and the different funds within the fund and the management of the fund using AfrExim or any collaboration with other the African DFIs will be interesting, and something that I'm sure there'll be more information more thinking regarding that as the months unfold. Agnes, do you want to comment on digital platforms for cross-border trade, and how do we make sure SMEs, for instance, are included in this emergent intra-African digital economy?
Thank you, Emeka.
And after that, we have a couple of questions on the question Q&A board, so we'll get to that after that.
Thank you, Emeka. I think, as you can hear from everybody, this is such an ambitious project. And I think as Africans, I think we can be excused for being a little bit pessimistic, because we have all these great initiative, great vision, but when it comes to the reality of it, it's always, the implementation is always a challenge. And I guess that's why such conversations are very important. On digital economy, there is a protocol on digital trade under AfCFTA. The negotiations were meant to start in this year. Unfortunately, I don't know how far the negotiations are ongoing. And the purpose of this is really understanding, given the current environment, the role of digital, the role of e-commerce in promoting intra-Africa trade. And the purpose of this is to try and harmonize digital policy, digital regulation across the member state of AfCFTA. One of the other objectives for this protocol is realizing the challenges of infrastructure development, right? So it's difficult to move goods from one end to another. So if we can do this, if we can promote e-commerce, hopefully that will make it easy for more people to participate in the trade. The role of SMEs, the importance of SMEs in making AfCFTA a success is another conversation that stakeholders have been having. And one of those is really empowering them to access digital payment platform. And I think everyone has alluded to what role the AfrExim Bank is playing by the payment platform. And promoting that, and I guess one of the challenges for a lot of SMEs is access to finance. Fintechs in the continent have played a great role in trying to bridge that gap of access to trade finance, and I think under the AfCFTA, and I think there's a conversation still under AfCFTA to establish a trade finance fund again to try and support SMEs to be able to participate or to access trade finance so they can be able to trade. So yes, conversation on digital economy are ongoing. I know some member states are a little bit reluctant, but I go looking at the economies today, that you cannot succeed unless you promote or you have regulation that promotes the digital economy and obviously digital payment platforms.
Absolutely, and I know Michael had alluded to the payment system that's already in place to facilitate the intra-African trade, and that's just a first step towards achieving that. One of the questions, this is from Patrick Odiegu from the participants, is how can the African Continental Free Trade Agreement encourage natural resources companies to access development funding, markets, and keeping the ownership African? I think anyone can take that.
Okay, so let me see if I can answer that. So the rules of origin that panelists have alluded to plays a key role here, because if the natural resources are extracted raw and they are transported out of Africa, value is added and is brought back into Africa, they may not qualify they will not be deemed as African goods under the AfCFTA. And when they are re-entering, the duty that will be charged on them will not be the same preferential duty that are used for African originated goods. So in order for manufacturers to benefit from the preferential treatment, they will need to have added substantial value on the African continent. So in a way, without specifically mentioning it, you are encouraging the processing of the raw materials on the continent. I don't know if this answers it in part. We are still monitoring to see how, especially when the investment protocol comes out, how citizen or a citizen will be defined under that protocol, because currently we are aware that because of local content across the continent, many local content laws will have to change because of the AfCFTA. But we are still unsure about the threshold that we meant for that. So we'll have to wait and see how things go before we can talk about the ownership, national ownership. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly, and that was a very good question, and thanks for that. Thanks for that response. Just I guess we should aim to wrap up within 10 minutes. There are a couple of other questions. This is a good one from an anonymous person. How are we dealing with the so-called Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone divide? Are we working enough to dismantle these artificially created blocks, vestiges of the colonial rule? For anyone who wants to take that.
If I can, Emeka, I think the vision of AfCFTA for me will address all those divides that were created not by us but the colonizers, but how we can individually correct that as individual organization, companies, is really trying to promote Africa trade, buy Africa, promote Africa, right? At the same time, really lobbying our governments to cooperate with other African countries. One example for me, a Kenyan, is that Kenya was negotiating bilateral trade with the US. And under AfCFTA, that is frowned upon, that any discussion, any negotiation should be done under the umbrella of AfCFTA, right? It's really encouraging conversation, continental conversation, working collectively as African nation rather than east, west, north, and south, right? But I guess it is a journey we have to start with ourselves. How many of us really patronize or spend or promote African organization or African products, right? I think most of us will go and buy designer products from the West because we think it's cool, but it has to start with us, not just our politicians, but ultimately our role as citizens, I guess, is really encouraging our stakeholders to work collectively. If you're in a position of power, particularly professional services like legal firms, or professional services like ours, is really trying to support in building capacity to promote this collective Africa vision, ultimately, because it will not only benefit us, but generations after us.
Yeah.
And if I can add to that, you have to take into consideration that these divides were put into place to serve economic interests outside the African continent. And now that we have this tool to boost intra-African trade and hopefully take the 100 million people that are projected to be removed or to come out of extreme poverty, we hope that the same tool that was used, economics, to establish them will also be used to break down these barriers that currently exist on the continent.
Yeah.
And to add to what Simi just said, we have the regional economic groups or blocks. So ECOWAS, for example, it's a mixture of Anglophone,
Francophone,
yeah. And in fact, I think a Lusophone, if I'm not mistaken. This is evidence that progress is being made. And in fact, Ghana, which has Anglophone roots, and La Côte d'Ivoire, which has Francophone roots, have started cooperating in the issue of cocoa. Like Cindy said, once the economics make sense, history does not really matter. And Ghana and La Côte d'Ivoire are about the largest producers of cocoa in the world. So they see the importance of coming together to determine prices. So they throw away their colonial history and look look forward at greater economic prosperity. So I agree 100% with Cindy. Once the economics make sense, I mean, history does not matter. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I think that's really, I think the focus here should really be on the economics of the case. Once the economics make sense, then people would act, rationally, presumably. Another question that came in quickly, and maybe we'll just take two more questions and we'll wrap this up. This is from Anthony in Njoroje. COVID-19 has led to a more digitally connected world, prompting many foreign companies to set up shop in AU member states. Are there measures in place to ensure African companies can participate in and thrive under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement at the same level as their foreign counterparts? And I think, Michael, you might have alluded to a little bit of this in your earlier response, but anyone can take this one.
If I may, Emeka, I guess that's in relation to access to finance. The reason some of these foreign companies are successful is obviously they have access to finance. One of the biggest challenges for African companies is access to finance. And I think AfCFTA is in the process of establishing the trade finance fund. So African companies can, in my view, participate in this with the support of finance from AfCFTA. Fintech was one of the biggest attraction for foreign investment in the continent in 2021 or during COVID time. And most of these fintech, I know there's a conversation that most fintech companies are usually mostly led by Westerners with a few locals participating in it. So I think it's working together, being innovative and creative, because if a project is creative enough, it's innovative and has an economic value, you will always be able to access finance. But in terms of, I think AfCFTA is quite creative in establishing this trade finance fund, realizing these opportunities and projects that would arise from the continent and supporting them in the financing part of it.
Yeah, sure. Cindy, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, attached to that, it's important to note that 56% of the African population is unbanked, and that's where fintech plays a big role. Like, for example, here in Kenya, Safaricom is able to reach about 80% of the unbanked population. In Nigeria, OPay, through its agency business as well as its digital wallet provision, is able to reach a significant number of the unbanked. And that essentially means that they can provide SMEs with much needed finance products. So we're hoping that fintech will be used to support the SME industry.
Absolutely. To just maybe we can take one more question and then just have the panelists give final thoughts for 30 seconds each. This is a pretty interesting question, and Michael, you might find this particularly interesting. As you know, Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah had a clause in its constitution that would cede sovereignty upon the realization of a United States of Africa. Are we anywhere close to this level of bringing Africa together? Thinking 50 years ahead from now, is a United States of Africa on the agenda? And are we in this conference willing to cede sovereignty for this strategic cause? I'll allow any two of you to respond to that. Then we can take final comments.
Wow. Well, I don't think I have the mandate of the Republic of Ghana to comment on that. But
it's above your pay grade.
Exactly, way above my pay grade. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, bless his soul, was a visionary, a PLS visionary. He saw things that were way behind before his time. But I see that there's this zeal. He has this speech where he says there's a new African in the world. It appears that the new African is rising. The sense of nationalism, not as states of Africa, but as Africans, is increasing. And that is one of the reasons why the AfCFTA has even received such rave reviews, and the political will is high. I will not push it as far as a political union. I would say that let's seek first the economics. Let the economics make sense first, and then we can look into the political. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to add, in Africa, at least in the southern part of Africa, politics, I think, play a disproportionately important role in our lives, and I think it's important that people take up the space which the AfCFTA is, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is creating. When Mike spoke earlier on, he spoke about trade and services, he spoke about the movement of people as being, and services as being as important as the movement of goods. And in my view, once the economics make sense, and when I'm saying economics, I'm not talking about exploitative economics, I'm talking about equitable economics, then what will flow almost as a matter of course will be the movement of people, which then begins to make nonsense of the artificially created borders. And Michael again referred to the regional economic blocks. Even in Southern Africa, you've got former German colonies. I think the only German colony really in the world, Namibia. You've got Mozambique on the other side, which was a Portuguese colony. You've got Angola, which was a Portuguese colony. You've got Central African Republic, which had French, and Burundi, which had French. So even within SADC, you've got a mixture, and yet that hasn't stopped the formation of SADC, and trade within SADC is continuing to grow. So I think that is, at least at an anecdotal level, evidence that once the economics begin to normalize and open up, Kwame Nkrumah's dream will perhaps start to take shape and find reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that response. And I think with this, we will just have, why don't we have a final word from Cindy, and from Cindy, then we'll hand over to Adobe from the Van Center to give the appreciation. Cindy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I think obviously the AfCFTA is very exciting. It's a very exciting prospect for us Africans. And we're only here today because we appreciate the potential that it has, not just to boost intra-African trade, but also to improve our infrastructure and to improve cohesion within the continent. So at Oraro and Company Advocates, this is a very important thing for us. And of course, as part of that whole initiative, we also became an affiliate of AD and David to be part of the continental story and to be able to offer like continental service. So once again, thank you to you, Emeka, the moderator, and my fellow panelists. Over to you, Adobe.
Thank you so much, Cindy, Emeka, and all of you. It's just been so exciting and wonderful listening to everybody and the discussion. It feels like we could go on and on without stopping. So thank you. My name is Ada Obi Ebuka. I direct the Africa program of the Cyrus R. Van Center for International Justice, and on whose behalf, along with Oraro and Company Advocates, our Africa Legal Fellows program, which is a program of the Van Center, in which we have two alumni today, Cindy and Meluleki. We want to thank every one of you for joining us today as part of our bi-monthly webinar series for our Africa Legal Fellows program. We launched this last year because we couldn't host any fellow due to the pandemic, as we've heard all the discussions going on post-COVID. So we're thinking of ways to revamp the program as we go along. It's been a very insightful, very in-depth discussion on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, really looking at the opportunities and challenges facing its implementation as African economies recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. We will send along to all participants today key outcomes of the discussions we've had. We also share the recordings with all of you. We want to especially thank Emeka Chumuba, who is a member of our Africa subcommittee of the Venn Center, for chairing this program today and the very excellent moderation, and to our panelists for the great engagement. It's been awesome listening to you from behind, and I'm sure for all our panelists too. We want to appreciate all our attendees who joined and stayed through to the end. We want to say a very big thank you to every one of you, and we're really grateful to the law firm of Oraro and Company, who are great partners of the Venn Center in Kenya, for effectively coordinating this webinar, and we hope that we'll continue to partner with you in other areas. Thank you so much, everybody. Many thanks for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right, thanks.